The wind through Cedar Hollow that night carried the smell of wet ash and something colder underneath it. Old stone, old rain, old grief that had never quite dried out. Maren Cole had a crowbar in one hand and a dying flashlight in the other, and she was 24 years old, standing in the dark outside a chapel that half the town said should have been bulldozed years ago. The doors were swollen shut, warped from fire and a decade of weather nobody had bothered to seal against. She wedged the crowbar into the gap and threw her whole weight into it, and somewhere behind her, out past the tree line, an owl called once and went quiet, like it didn't want to be caught listening either. She'd paid $340 to keep this building out of a county auction. $340, and a signature on a form that made her, officially, the last living owner of the Cedar Hollow Chapel. Scorched roof, collapsed east wall, and all. It wasn't the money that had brought her here in the dark, alone, 3 days after closing on the deed. It was what she'd found folded inside the property notice. A single line in her grandfather's handwriting, added almost as an afterthought at the bottom of an otherwise official document. "Look under where I used to stand." She didn't know yet what that meant. She didn't know, standing there prying at a door that hadn't opened in 10 years, that by morning she'd have uncovered something that would make 3 separate people in this town stop pretending they'd never heard the name Cole. Maybe you know a little about that feeling, the one where you're holding a key to something, but you don't yet understand what it actually unlocks. If you've ever inherited more questions than answers, stick around for this one. I think you'll feel this story in your chest. The door gave with a groan and a shower of blackened splinters, and the smell hit her first. Char, and underneath it, faintly, still, incense. 10 years gone, and the incense was still there, ghosted into the stone. Her flashlight beam swept across broken pews, shoved into a pile against one wall. A caved section of roof, letting in a ragged patch of night sky. And at the far end, where the altar used to be, a floor that didn't look quite right. A seam in the stone that didn't match the rest. "Look under where I used to stand." She crossed the chapel floor slowly, glass and ash crunching under her boots, and knelt where the old pulpit would have been. Her fingers found the edge of a stone slab, slightly raised, slightly loose. Something underneath it caught the flashlight beam and threw it back. Metal, dull with grime, but unmistakably metal, and Maren's breath caught in a way that had nothing to do with the smoke-damaged air. She didn't get it open that night. That's the thing nobody tells you about moments like this. They don't resolve themselves the way they do in your head. The slab wouldn't budge, her flashlight died, and she sat back on her heels in the dark of a burned chapel that belonged to her now, whether she understood why or not. To understand how a disowned 24-year-old ended up alone in her dead grandfather's church at midnight with a crowbar, we have to go back 3 weeks, to a Tuesday that started like every other Tuesday of the last 2 years of her life. She was living out of a single room above a laundromat in a city 4 hours from Cedar Hollow, working the early shift at a diner and the late shift stocking shelves, and she had exactly $211 to her name, money she'd been building back up, slowly, since the last time her mother had made it clear there was no place for her at the family table. That had been 6 years ago. Maren didn't talk about it much. When people asked why she didn't go home for holidays, she'd just say, quietly, that home wasn't really a place that existed for her anymore. Her father had died when she was 19. A car accident on a wet road outside Cedar Hollow, the same town he'd grown up in, the same town his father had preached in for 40 years. Her mother had remarried within 2 years. And somewhere in the middle of the funeral and the remarriage and the slow erasure of every photograph that had Maren in it, her mother had simply stopped calling. Her grandfather Silas hadn't stopped, not entirely. A birthday card most years, always a little late, always signed the same way. "Still thinking of you, kid. SC. She hadn't seen him in person since she was 17. The letter that changed everything came on a Tuesday, in a plain envelope from a county courthouse she'd never heard of, informing her that Silas Cole had passed away in March, 5 months earlier, and nobody in her family had thought to tell her, and that she had been named in his will as the sole inheritor of one property, the Cedar Hollow Chapel, condemned, tax delinquent, and scheduled for county auction in 30 days, unless the debt was settled. $340. That was what stood between her and losing something she hadn't even known was hers. She almost didn't go. She sat on the edge of her bed, with the letter in her lap for the better part of an hour, doing the math on what it would cost to get there, what it would mean to walk back into a town that had quietly closed its doors on her the same year her mother had. But there was a line in the courthouse letter, tucked in among the legal language, that she read maybe a dozen times before she let herself believe it. The deceased left specific instructions that this notification go to Maren Elizabeth Cole and no other family member. Her grandfather had made sure of that, on purpose, which meant he'd known something about her, about the chapel, about the family that had let her go, that he'd never gotten the chance to say out loud. She paid the back taxes with money she couldn't really spare. She packed one bag, and on a grey Thursday afternoon, she drove into Cedar Hollow for the first time in 7 years, past the gas station that hadn't changed its sign, past the diner where a woman on the porch swing watched her car go by a little too long, like she recognized it, or thought she should. The chapel itself sat at the edge of town on a rise of overgrown grass, its bell tower black with old smoke damage, half its roofline sagging inward. Someone, she never did find out who, had nailed a hand-lettered sign to the fence post out front. Private property. Stay out. No name. No date. She stood at the gate for a long moment before she let herself through it, and that's the part of this story that's easy to skip past. But I don't think you should. That pause, that private moment of maybe this was a mistake, standing in front of the one thing she owned in the whole world, and realizing it looked like it was already halfway back into the ground. She didn't turn around. She had nowhere left to turn around to. That first week, she slept in her car in the chapel yard because the county wouldn't clear the building for occupancy, and she spent her days clearing debris, boarding the worst of the roof gaps, and trying not to notice the way certain people in town watched her from a careful distance. The man at the hardware store who'd gone quiet when she gave her name, the woman at the gas station who'd asked, too casually, whether she was Silas's people. Nobody in Cedar Hollow said much to her directly, but on her 4th night there, someone left a covered casserole dish on the chapel steps with no note, and on her 6th, she found a single word scratched into the dust on her car's back windshield. Welcome. She still didn't know, that first week, about the stone slab under the altar, or the metal box waiting beneath it, or the fact that her grandfather had spent the last 2 years of his life quietly telling at least one person in this town exactly what he intended to leave behind, and why. All she knew, standing in the wreck of a chapel that smelled like rain and old smoke, was that her grandfather had trusted her with something specific, and that somewhere in this burned-out building he'd left her the reason. The morning after she found the stone slab, Maren woke up stiff and cold in the driver's seat of her car, her neck aching, sunlight cutting hard through a windshield, still faintly marked with the word someone had left her 6 days before. She'd meant to sleep for an hour. She'd slept for 9. Her first thought, before her eyes were even fully open, was the metal box. She could still feel the shape of it under her fingers from the night before. Flat, rectangular, the size of a large book, wedged into a cavity beneath the altar stone that she hadn't managed to fully pry loose before her flashlight died and exhaustion finally won. She ate a cold biscuit from the diner bag on her passenger seat, drank water warm from sitting in the car overnight, and walked back into the chapel with the morning light, doing what her flashlight couldn't, showing her, all at once, exactly how much work stood between her and a building anyone could safely stand inside. The east wall had partially collapsed. Timber and stone spilled inward, like the building had exhaled and never quite recovered. Sunlight came down through the broken roof in long gold columns, catching the dust she'd kicked up. And for a moment, just a moment, it looked less like a ruin and more like something waiting to be finished. She kept walking, put both hands flat against the loose section of the altar slab, and pushed. It gave this time, stubborn, scraping, but it gave, and she sat back hard on the stone floor when it finally shifted enough to reveal the metal box in full. It was a strong box, old, the kind with a simple hasp and a small brass lock, rust bleeding down its sides in thin orange trails, no key. She sat there with it in her lap for a long time before she did anything else. Something about it felt like it deserved that, a pause, some kind of respect, before she broke it open like a stranger. That's not going to open itself, if that's what you're waiting on. Maren nearly dropped the box. A man stood in the chapel doorway, mid-60s maybe, weathered in the way of someone who'd spent a life outdoors, a canvas jacket over a flannel shirt, a tool bag slung over one shoulder. He hadn't announced himself walking up, or she'd simply been too far inside her own head to hear him. "I didn't know anyone was allowed in here," she said, which wasn't quite what she meant, but it was what came out. "Nobody's allowed in here. Buildings condemned." He said it flat, not unkind, and took a step inside, glancing up at the collapsed roofline with the practiced eye of someone assessing a job rather than gawking at wreckage. "But I figured the new owner could use a hand, and I heard the new owner was sleeping in her car." Word travels. Cedar Hollow's got about 400 people and one gas station. Word doesn't travel here. It just sort of exists everywhere at once. He set his tool bag down inside the door, still keeping a respectful distance. "Name's Del Whitfield. I did roofing and general repair work for your grandfather, on and off, better part of 20 years. The name landed somewhere in her chest before she could stop it. 20 years. This stranger had known Silas Cole longer, more recently, more completely than she had. "Maren," she said, "I know who you are." He said it plainly, not unkindly, and something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, more like the loosening of something that had been held carefully in place. "You've got his eyes. Everybody in town's gonna tell you that within your first month here, so I figured I'd get it out of the way early." She looked down at the strongbox in her lap, not sure what to do with that information, not sure what to do with any of it. The roof, the town, the box. A stranger who'd apparently known her grandfather better than her own mother had let her know him. "Did he talk about me?" she asked, before she'd decided whether she wanted the answer. Del was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet, she heard the wind move through the broken roof, heard a bird settle somewhere in the exposed rafters above them, heard the particular silence of a man deciding how much to say. "More than you'd think," he said finally. "Less than he should have, maybe. That's not really my story to tell, though. That's his." He nodded toward the box in her lap. "That looked like something he might have left specific instructions about." "There's no key." "There's a locksmith in Aldridge, 20 minutes east." Or, he crouched, examining the lock without touching it. "That's an old hasp. I could probably get it open with the right tool, if you trust me to try." She should have said no. She'd known this man for 4 minutes. But something about the way he'd said that's his story to tell, like he was protecting something rather than withholding it, made her nod before she'd fully thought it through. It took him under 2 minutes, with a small pry bar and a practiced hand, and the hasp gave with a dry metallic snap that seemed too loud for the quiet chapel. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, now brittle and yellowed, were two things: a thick bundle of cash, bound with a strip of leather, and a folded letter, the paper gone soft and pale with age, sealed with a bit of wax that had cracked down the middle. Maren didn't reach for the money first. She reached for the letter. "I'll step outside," Dell said, already rising, already moving toward the door with the kind of tact that told her this wasn't the first time he'd given a grieving person room to read something alone. "You don't have to. I do, actually." He paused at the doorway, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Grief, maybe, or something adjacent to it. "Your grandfather was a good man, Maren. Whatever this town's told you, whatever your family's told you, he was a good man who ran out of time before he ran out of things he wanted to fix. I'll be out front." "Take your time." She sat alone in the ruined chapel, sunlight moving slow across the stone floor, and unfolded a letter her grandfather had written and hidden before she'd even known he was sick. "Maren, if you're reading this, it means the county did what I always feared they'd do, and let this place go to auction, and you were the one who came for it. I want you to know that wasn't luck. I made sure of it, best I could, in the only ways a stubborn old man tucked away in Cedar Hollow still had power to make sure of anything. I know I wasn't there enough. I know 6 years is a long silence to sit on, and I know I let more of it happen than I should have. That's a regret I'll carry to wherever I'm headed next, and I don't expect a letter to undo it. But I want you to understand something about this building, and about what's in this box, before you decide what any of it means. The money isn't the inheritance. The money is just what's left over from a life of not spending much and not trusting banks. The real thing I'm leaving you is this chapel, and everything it still knows how to be, if somebody's willing to put the work in. There's more to why I left it to you and no one else, more than I can fit in one letter, and more than I think you're ready to hear all at once. Ask Dell about the tower. Ask him when you're ready, not before. Still thinking of you, kid. Always was." S.C. Maren read it twice, then a third time, her thumb tracing the place where his handwriting had pressed slightly harder on certain words, like he'd paused there, like the pen itself had felt the weight of what he was writing. Ask him about the tower. She looked up, through the ragged hole in the roof, toward the blackened bell tower rising crooked against the morning sky, the one part of the chapel she hadn't gone near yet, because the county notice had specifically flagged it as structurally unsound. There was more here. Her grandfather had said so himself, in his own hand, and he'd said it in a way that made clear he'd been careful, deliberate, about what he revealed and when. She counted the money without really seeing it, some several $1,000s, more than she'd held at one time in her whole life, and it didn't feel like the point. Not with that letter in her other hand, not with a bell tower standing damaged and silent above her, holding whatever her grandfather hadn't been ready, or hadn't had time, to say outright. She found Dell sitting on the tailgate of his truck out front, giving her exactly as much space as he'd promised. "He mentioned the tower," she said, before she'd fully decided to say it. "In the letter, said I should ask you. When I was ready." Something crossed Dell's face, surprise maybe, or something closer to relief, like a weight he'd been carrying alone for months, had just shifted onto someone else's shoulders too. "He said that, huh?" Dell looked past her, up at the crooked black silhouette of the tower against the sky, and for a long moment he didn't say anything else at all. "Are you ready?" he asked finally. Maren looked back at the chapel, at the building that had cost her $340 and was turning out to hold considerably more than that, and thought about 6 years of silence, and a grandfather who'd apparently spent the end of his life building toward a moment he'd never get to see. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I want to be." Dell didn't answer her right away. He climbed down off the tailgate, walked a slow half-circle around the chapel yard, like he was buying himself time to think, and finally stopped with his back to the tower, facing her instead. "Your grandfather built that tower himself," he said. "Not the original. That one came down in a storm sometime in the 50s, before either of our times. He rebuilt it in 1987. I know the year because I was 19, and he paid me $11 a day to haul lumber up a ladder, which felt like a fortune at the time." "That's not what I asked." "I know it's not." He almost smiled. "I'm getting there. Man deserves to have his story told in order." Maren crossed her arms against the morning chill still hanging in the yard, waiting. Somewhere behind her, inside the chapel, a loose shingle shifted in the wind and settled with a small clatter, and she found herself cataloguing every sound the building made now, like it was a language she was slowly starting to learn. "There's a compartment up in the belfry," Dell said. "Behind the bell housing. Your grandfather built it in when he rebuilt the tower. I helped him frame it out, though at the time I thought it was just storage for tools. It wasn't until years later, maybe 8-9 years ago, that he told me what it actually held." "Which was?" "That's the part where I've got to be careful," Dell said, and for the first time since he'd walked into the chapel that morning, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. "He made me promise something, Maren, that if this day ever came, if you ever showed up here, ready to hear it, I wouldn't just hand you the whole thing at once. He wanted you to find pieces of it yourself. Said it mattered that you did the finding, not just the receiving." She wanted to be frustrated by that. Some part of her was frustrated by that. A man she'd known for 4 minutes was standing in front of her, gatekeeping a truth about her own family that she had every right to. But underneath the frustration was something else, something that felt uncomfortably close to recognition. Her grandfather had always been like that, even in the scraps of memory she still carried from childhood, never handing her an answer when he could hand her a question instead. "Fine," she said, "then tell me what you can." "The tower's not safe to climb yet. County flagged the stairwell, and they weren't wrong. I looked at it 2 days ago. Some of those treads won't hold weight." Dell rubbed a hand across his jaw. "I can help you shore it up. It's maybe a week of work, if we're careful, less if we get lucky with the weather. But I'm not letting you go up there until it's solid. Whatever's waiting can wait 1 more week. It's waited a lot longer than that already." It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it had the shape of something true, something practical, something that respected the building rather than just the mystery inside it. She nodded, slowly, and something in her chest that had been braced tight since she'd read the letter loosened by a fraction. "Why do this?" she asked. "The roofing work. Helping me now. You didn't have to come out here." Dell considered the question longer than she expected. "Your grandfather helped raise half this town's barns, fixed half its roofs, sat with more than a few people through the worst nights of their lives, mine included. I lost my wife 11 years back. Cancer, quick and mean, and Silas Cole sat in my kitchen 3 nights a week for 2 months afterward, not saying much, just being there so the house wasn't so quiet." He looked back at the chapel. "So when he asked me to look after this place if anything happened to him, and to look out for whoever inherited it, I wasn't about to say no. Some debts you don't pay back, you pay forward." That, more than anything he'd said yet, told her something true about the man she'd barely known. Silas Cole hadn't just been a name on a birthday card. He'd been a fixture in this town's quiet architecture of care, the kind of man people leaned on without ever quite saying so out loud. They spent the rest of the morning clearing debris from the chapel's interior, Dell directing, Maren hauling, both of them working in a silence that felt less awkward with every passing hour. Around midday, a woman appeared at the fence line, maybe 50, sharp-eyed, arms crossed, watching them work with an expression Maren couldn't immediately place, as friendly or otherwise. "That's Ruth Ann Pruitt," Dell said, following her gaze. "Runs the general store. Fair warning, she's going to have opinions about you being here, and she is not shy about sharing them." Ruth Ann didn't come through the gate. She stood at the fence, taking in the collapsed wall and the tarped section of roof, with an expression that read closer to judgment than concern. "Heard you were back," Ruth Ann called out. Not quite a greeting. "Word travels," Marin said again, echoing Dell without quite meaning to. "This town's got a long memory, if that's what you're asking." Ruth Ann's eyes moved from Marin to Dell and back again, cataloguing something Marin couldn't read. "Your grandfather spent the better part of 10 years trying to fix this building up out of his own pocket, and the county kept finding new reasons to block him. Historical easement issues, zoning disputes. Man died still fighting that battle." She said it flatly, like a fact rather than an accusation, but there was something underneath it that Marin couldn't name yet. Not quite anger, not quite grief. Something tangled between the two. "You knew him well?" Marin asked. "Everybody in this town knew him well. That's sort of the problem, isn't it?" Ruth Ann's gaze sharpened, just slightly. "You planning on finishing what he started, or just cashing out once you've cleared the title? Because I'll tell you plainly, there's people in this town who'd rather see this place stay a ruin than watch it sold off to somebody who doesn't understand what it meant to him." The accusation landed harder than Marin expected, mostly because she didn't have a ready answer for it. She hadn't thought that far ahead. She'd come here to settle a debt, to claim what was legally hers, and everything since, the letter, the tower, Dell's quiet loyalty, had reframed the whole situation into something she hadn't fully caught up to yet. "I don't know what I'm doing yet," Marin admitted, and something about saying it out loud, to a stranger, in front of a burned building that used to belong to a grandfather she barely knew, felt like the first fully honest thing she'd said since arriving in Cedar Hollow. "But I'm not selling it. Not before I understand why he wanted me to have it instead of anyone else." Ruth Ann studied her for a long moment, arms still crossed, and something in her posture eased by a degree Marin almost missed. "Well, that's a better answer than I expected." She turned to go, then paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "There's a photograph in the Historical Society building, if you're curious, taken back in the 70s. Your grandfather standing in front of this chapel with a whole group of people. Your mother's in it too, if you look close. She was about 7. She left before Marin could ask anything else, walking back down the road toward town with the unhurried gait of someone who'd said exactly as much as she'd intended to, and not one word more. Marin stood at the fence for a long moment after she'd gone, turning the new information over. A photograph, her mother at 7 years old, standing somewhere in this yard beside a grandfather who'd apparently mattered to this whole town in ways she was only beginning to understand. "You all right?" Dell asked, coming to stand beside her. "Everyone here knows more about my own family than I do," she said. "That's Cedar Hollow for you." He said it gently, not unkindly. Small towns don't forget people. Not the ones worth remembering anyway. He nodded toward the chapel behind them, roof open to the sky, altar slab still shifted aside from where the strongbox had waited for years. "Come on! Let's get that east wall braced before the weather turns. Historical Society building's not going anywhere. Neither is that photograph." Marin looked back at the chapel one more time before she followed him. At the crooked black tower, holding its unopened compartment. At the altar floor that had already given up one secret. At a building that seemed determined to hand her the truth about her family, one careful piece at a time, exactly the way her grandfather had apparently wanted it. She didn't know yet what she'd find in that photograph, or what waited behind the bell housing, or why her mother's absence from this town felt, more and more, like it had less to do with Maren than she'd always assumed. But for the first time since she'd arrived, she wanted to stay long enough to find out. The Historical Society building turned out to be a converted one-room schoolhouse 2 streets off Cedar Hollow's main strip, its windows fogged with age. A hand-painted sign out front, listing hours that seemed more aspirational than actual. Maren found it locked when she and Dell walked over the next morning, but a note taped inside the glass read simply, "Back in 20, ask at the store if urgent." "That's Pearl," Dell said. "She runs this place mostly on faith, and a key she keeps in her apron pocket. Come on." Pearl turned out to be closer to 80 than 70, small and quick-moving, with the kind of sharp, attentive eyes that suggested she'd spent a lifetime noticing things other people missed. When Dell explained who Maren was, Pearl's whole face changed. Not suspicion, the way Ruth Ann's had, but something closer to delight, tinged with an old sadness she didn't bother hiding. "Silas's girl," Pearl said, taking both of Maren's hands in hers before Maren had even fully stepped through the door. "Well, I'll be—" Come in. Let me find that photograph before I lose the thread of where I put it. I'm 81, dear, and my filing system is mostly prayer." The schoolhouse smelled like dust and old paper, its walls lined with donated furniture, glass display cases full of arrowheads and farm tools, and yellowed newspaper clippings. Pearl disappeared into a back room and returned several minutes later with a cardboard box, setting it down on a scarred wooden table with the reverence of someone handling something sacred. "Cedar Hollow Founding Families," Pearl said, flipping through envelopes of photographs with practiced fingers. "This town's never been big enough to need a real archive, so it's mostly just me and whatever people brought in over the years. Here." She slid a photograph across the table. Black and white, slightly overexposed, a group of maybe 15 people standing in front of the chapel. Younger, whole, its roof intact, its bell tower standing straight and proud against a summer sky. Maren's eyes went immediately to the center of the group, where a tall man with a kind, weathered face stood with his hand resting lightly on the shoulder of a small girl in a pale dress, her hair in careful braids, squinting slightly against the sun. "That's him," Maren said quietly. "That's my grandfather. And that," Pearl said, tapping the girl gently, "would be your mother, Diane. She was 7 that summer. I remember, because it was the year the chapel got its new bell, and there was a whole to-do about it. A dedication ceremony. Half the county showed up." Maren studied the photograph for a long moment, trying to reconcile the woman she knew, sharp-edged, distant, prone to long silences that Maren had spent years trying to interpret, with this small girl standing close against her father's side, looking, in this one frozen moment, entirely happy. "She looks like she loved it here," Maren said. She did. Everybody did, back then. Pearl's expression shifted, something more careful entering her voice. "There's a woman in this picture you should know about, dear. Right there, at the end." Maren followed Pearl's finger to a young woman standing slightly apart from the main group, dark-haired, maybe mid-20s in the photograph, her expression harder to read than the others. Not unhappy exactly, but guarded, the way someone looks when they're aware of being photographed and haven't quite decided how much of themselves to show. Who was she? Pearl exchanged a glance with Dell that Maren didn't fully understand, some silent adult calculation passing between two people who'd clearly discussed this before, or at least anticipated the question. "Her name was Eleanor," Pearl said carefully. "Eleanor Voss. She and your grandfather were close, for a time. Very close." She paused, choosing her next words with visible care. "This isn't my story to tell in full, dear, but I'll tell you the shape of it, and you can ask Dell or your grandfather's letters for the rest, if there's more to find." "There's more," Dell confirmed quietly. In the tower. Pearl nodded, unsurprised, and continued. Eleanor came to Cedar Hollow the same year your grandfather rebuilt that bell tower, 1987, though she'd known him a few years before that too. She wasn't from here. Nobody quite knew where she'd come from. Only that she showed up with almost nothing, same as you did, if you don't mind me saying so, and your grandfather took an interest in her the way he took an interest in anybody who needed a hand up. An interest, Marin repeated carefully. It became more than that over time. Your grandmother had passed some years before. You'd have been too young to remember her. And Eleanor and Silas grew close in a way the whole town noticed. Whether either of them said so out loud or not, Pearl's voice softened. But there was a falling out, a bad one. Nobody in this town ever got the full truth of what caused it. Only that Eleanor left Cedar Hollow sometime in 1989 and never came back, and your grandfather never spoke her name again for as long as I knew him. Not once. Not even to me, and I sat with that man over coffee every Sunday morning for 30 years. Marin looked back down at the photograph, at Eleanor's guarded, careful expression, at her small distance from the rest of the group, even in a moment meant to be celebratory. Why does this matter? Marin asked, though some part of her suspected she already knew the shape of the answer, even before Pearl said it. Because your grandfather rebuilt that tower the same year Eleanor left, Pearl said gently, and he built that hidden compartment into it the same summer. I always assumed, and I want to be clear, dear, this is an old woman's assumption, not a fact I can swear to, that whatever's up there has something to do with her. Something he wanted kept, and kept hidden long after she was gone. The room went quiet, except for the tick of an old clock somewhere in the back, and Marin found herself staring at the photograph until the faces started to blur slightly at the edges, her grandfather's hand resting on her mother's shoulder, Eleanor standing apart at the edge of the frame, like she already knew, even then, that she wouldn't stay in it for long. Does my mother know about any of this? Marin asked. Pearl and Dell exchanged another glance, and this time Dell was the one who answered. I couldn't say for certain what Diane knows or doesn't know. She left Cedar Hollow herself, not long after she turned 18, and she didn't come back much after that either. A funeral here or there, nothing more. Your grandfather never talked about why, and I never felt it was my place to ask a man his own private griefs. Marin thought of her mother's silences, the ones that had stretched across Marin's whole childhood, the careful way she'd always steered conversations away from Cedar Hollow, away from Silas, away from anything resembling this town's particular history. She'd always assumed it was about her father's death, about grief too heavy to revisit. Now she wondered if it went back further than that, tangled into something that had happened here decades before Marin was even born. I want to see what's in that tower, Marin said quietly. I know you do. Dell's voice was gentle but firm. And you will, once it's safe. I promise you that. But Marin... He paused, choosing his words carefully, the way he seemed to choose most things. Whatever's up there, it might not give you clean answers. Sometimes the things people hide away aren't secrets waiting to be solved. Sometimes they're just grief, folded up small enough to carry. She nodded slowly, though the words didn't fully land the way she suspected he meant them to. Not yet. Not until she'd actually climbed those stairs and seen for herself what her grandfather had spent 30-some years keeping folded away. Pearl carefully returned the photograph to its envelope, then hesitated, and slid it back across the table toward Marin instead. Keep it, she said. Feels like it belongs with you, more than it belongs in a cardboard box in my back room. Marin took it carefully, tucking it into her jacket pocket like something fragile, and thanked Pearl with a warmth that surprised her, given they'd known each other less than an hour. Walking back toward the chapel with Dell, the photograph a small weight against her chest, Maren found herself turning over Pearl's words about her mother. She left, and she didn't come back much after that either, and wondering, for the first time, whether the distance her mother had built around Cedar Hollow, around Silas, around the very idea of family, had started here, in this town, decades before Maren was ever part of the equation at all. Whatever had happened between her grandfather and Eleanor Voss, it had reached far enough forward to touch her mother's life, and her own, without either of them ever fully understanding why. She wanted to know why. She was starting to suspect she wouldn't like all of the answer. 5 days passed in a rhythm Maren hadn't expected to find so quickly. Up before the sun, coffee from a thermos Dell brought without being asked, hours of bracing timber and replacing rotted stair treads in the tower stairwell, while the rest of the chapel slowly shed its wreckage around them. The work changed her hands first. Blisters, then calluses, then a kind of steadiness she hadn't had in years. The particular confidence of a body that had learned, again, what it was capable of. It changed the chapel too. The east wall stood braced and squared. The roof held 2 new sections of sheeting that no longer let rain drip onto the altar floor. Cedar Hollow, in turn, seemed to be changing its mind about her one small gesture at a time. A wave from the hardware store owner who'd gone quiet before. A plate of cornbread left on her car's hood with no note. A teenage boy who showed up unasked on the 3rd day and worked 4 hours hauling debris before disappearing again without giving his name. "That's Tommy," Dell said, watching the boy go. "Ruth Ann's nephew. Don't read too much into it, but don't read too little into it either." Maren didn't fully understand what he meant until the 4th evening, when Ruth Ann herself appeared at the fence line again. This time, with a box of nails and a coil of rope, she sat down without comment, watching the tower scaffold for a long moment before speaking. "Dell tells me the stairwell's near solid," Ruth Ann said. "Almost. 2 more days, maybe." Ruth Ann nodded, arms still crossed, though something in her posture had softened since their first conversation. Not warm exactly, but no longer bracing for a fight either. "My mother used to clean this chapel, back when it still held services. She'd take me with her some Saturdays, when I was small. I used to hate it, dusting pews, polishing the rail, boring work for a kid." She looked up at the tower. "I didn't hate the bell, though. Your grandfather used to let me ring it, if I'd finished my chores." Said a chapel bell should belong to the whole town, not just whoever owned the building. It was the first thing approaching a fond memory Ruth Ann had offered, and Maren understood, without either of them saying it directly, that it was meant as something like an apology for that first hard conversation at the fence. "Thank you for telling me that," Maren said. Ruth Ann shrugged, but didn't leave right away. "You asked me before if I thought you were fixing this place up, or just cashing out. I want to say, plainly, I don't think that anymore." She turned to go, then paused. "There's a supper at the church hall Sunday. Whole town turns out for it. You should come. Might do you good to meet Cedar Hollow when it's not watching you from a distance." She left before Maren could fully respond, and Maren stood at the fence a long moment, turning over the invitation with something that felt suspiciously like hope. The stairwell was declared solid on the 6th day. Dell tested each tread twice before he let her follow him up, the 2 of them climbing slowly through a narrow spiral of aged wood, dust sifting down around them in the shafts of afternoon light that came through gaps in the tower's old siding. The air grew warmer as they climbed, closer, thick with the smell of old timber, and something underneath it Maren couldn't immediately place. Cedar, maybe, or some kind of preserving oil. The belfry itself was small, round, the great iron bell hanging silent and green with age at its center. Dell crossed to the far side, running his hand along a section of wall paneling until his fingers found some catch Maren couldn't see, and a panel swung inward with a soft groan, revealing a compartment perhaps 3 feet deep, dim and undisturbed. "I haven't looked in here myself," Dell said quietly. "Not once, in almost 40 years. He asked me not to, and I never did. Whatever's in there, you're the first person to see it since he closed that panel." Maren knelt in front of the opening, her heart going harder than she expected, for something that was, physically, just a dark space in an old wall. Inside, she could make out the shapes of several objects: a wooden box, smaller than the strong box from the altar, a bundle of what looked like letters, tied with faded ribbon, and, propped carefully against the back wall, a framed photograph she couldn't yet make out in the dim light. She reached for the photograph first. It was Eleanor, younger than in Pearl's photograph, laughing at something outside the frame, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, sunlight catching her in a moment that felt entirely unguarded, nothing like the careful, watchful expression Maren had seen at the edge of the group photo. Someone had loved her enough to capture her like this, and loved this image enough to hide it away for 30-some years rather than destroy it. The wooden box held a woman's ring, simple, a small clear stone catching what little light reached it, and beneath it, folded flat, a pressed flower gone brown and brittle with age. The letters, when Maren carefully untied the ribbon and unfolded the first one, were in 2 different hands. Her grandfather's careful, slanted script, and another hand, rounder, quicker, unmistakably a different writer. A correspondence, back and forth, dated across several months in 1989. She read the first letter in her grandfather's hand, sitting cross-legged on the belfry floor while Dell waited quietly by the stairwell, giving her the same careful distance he'd given her with the first letter, days before. "Eleanor, I don't know if this will reach you, or if you even want it to. I've written 6 versions of this letter and burned 5 of them, which should tell you something about how poorly I'm managing all this. I understand why you left. I've turned it over every way I know how, and I keep landing in the same place. You were right to be afraid of what staying would cost you, and I was too much of a coward, or too tied to this town, or too worried what people would say about an old widower and a woman 15 years his junior, to give you a reason to stay instead. I should have chosen you plainly, in front of everyone, instead of asking you to wait in the shadows of my own hesitation. That's a regret I expect to carry the rest of my life, and I don't say that to make you feel responsible for my grief. I say it because you deserve to know I understood, eventually, even if I understood it too late. Diane doesn't know the full shape of it. She only knows you left, and that I grieved something she couldn't name, and I think, in her own 7-year-old way, she decided the safest thing was to stop asking questions about anything that made her father go quiet. I worry, some nights, about what that taught her. I worry I taught my own daughter that love is a thing you don't ask about, because asking might make it disappear. I'm building a place for what we were, up here where the bell can watch over it. Foolish, maybe, but I wanted somewhere it could exist, even if it couldn't exist in the open the way it should have. The letter ended there, unsigned, and Maren sat with it for a long moment, the pieces of the last several days rearranging themselves into a shape she was only beginning to understand. Her mother's silences, her mother's careful distance from any conversation involving love or grief, the particular way Diane had always flinched from questions about her own father. I worry I taught my own daughter that love is a thing you don't ask about. Maren thought of her own life, the guardedness Dell had noticed in her within minutes of meeting her, the 6 years of silence she'd let stretch between herself and her mother without ever quite fighting to close it, the way she'd assumed, always, that asking for connection was a kind of weakness she couldn't afford. She hadn't just inherited a chapel, she'd inherited a pattern, 3 generations deep, of people who loved each other and never quite said so out loud until it was too late to matter. "There's more letters," she said quietly, her voice rougher than she expected. "Take your time," Dell said. "We've got nothing but time now. That's the whole point of finally opening it." Maren picked up the second letter, Eleanor's rounder hand, and began to read, and somewhere below them, through the open belfry slats, the wind moved across Cedar Hollow with the particular hush of late afternoon, carrying with it the first small threads of a truth Maren was starting to suspect would reach far beyond this tower, all the way to a mother she hadn't spoken to in 6 years. Eleanor's letter was dated 3 weeks after Silas's, the paper thinner, the ink faded to a soft brown that made Maren angle it toward the light to read clearly. "Silas, I got your letter. I've read it more times than I should probably admit. I'm not writing back because I've forgiven you, or because I haven't. I'm writing back because I think we both deserve to have said the whole truth once, plainly, even if it changes nothing. You're right that I was afraid. But you should know, it wasn't just the town's opinion I was afraid of. It was Diane. I watched that little girl watch me, every time I came around, with an expression I understood better than I wanted to. She was afraid I'd take you away from her, and I couldn't blame her for it. She'd already lost her mother. I wasn't going to be the reason she felt like she was losing her father too, even if losing him only meant sharing him, so I left before I could become that. I told myself it was noble. Maybe it was. Maybe it was just easier than staying and finding out whether I was right. I don't regret loving you, Silas. I regret that we built something we were both too careful to protect out loud. Take care of that girl. Let her know, somehow, some way you can manage, that love doesn't have to be a thing people lose each other over. I never got the chance to show her that." "Maybe you still can." Maren set the letter down carefully in her lap, her chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with the tower's close, warm air. Dell had settled onto an old crate near the stairwell, giving her space, but staying close enough that she didn't feel entirely alone with it. "She left to protect my mother," Maren said quietly. "Not because she didn't love him, because she thought staying would hurt a little girl who was already scared of losing people." "Sounds like it," Dell said gently, "and he let her go because he didn't know how to fight for both of them at once." Maren looked down at the remaining letters, still bundled, still unread, and felt something settle into place that had been loose and aching since she'd first read her grandfather's line in the courthouse notice. That's the pattern, isn't it? That's what got passed down, not the chapel, not the money. This specific, exact way of loving someone and still finding a reason to let them go quiet instead of loud. Dell didn't answer right away, and when he did, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard from him yet. "I watched your grandfather carry that regret for 30 years, Maren. I watched it sit on him every single day, even when he didn't say her name. I think part of why he built this compartment, why he hid all this away, instead of just burning it like grief usually tells a person to do, I think he was hoping somebody, someday, would find it and do something different with what they learned. Break it, maybe. The pattern, I mean." Maren looked up at him. "Is that why you never opened it yourself, even after almost 40 years? Wasn't mine to open, wasn't mine to fix, either." He met her eyes steadily. "But it might be yours." The rest of the letters told the shape of a 2-year correspondence that grew sparser with time, Eleanor's replies coming less frequently, her tone gentler each time, less anguished, more like someone slowly making peace with a door she'd chosen to close herself. The final letter in the bundle, dated late 1991, was brief. "Silas, I'm settled now, somewhere good, somewhere kind. I think this should be the last letter, not because I've stopped caring what happens to you, but because I think we've both said what needed saying, and there's a kindness in letting a thing rest once it's been spoken honestly. Take care of Diane. Take care of yourself. I mean that as fully as I've ever meant anything. There was no letter after that. Maren sat with the finality of it, the way Eleanor had chosen, deliberately, to close the correspondence rather than let it fade into silence, the way so much else in this family seemed to fade. It struck her as its own kind of quiet bravery, choosing an ending instead of just letting one happen. "Do you know what became of her?" Maren asked. "Eleanor. Is she still—" "I don't know," Dell admitted. "Your grandfather never said, not once in all the years I knew him. Whether he lost track of her on purpose, or whether he simply carried the not knowing as part of his penance, I couldn't tell you." He paused. "Pearl might know more. She kept up more of the old town correspondence than I ever did. Might be worth asking, if you want to know." Maren looked down at the photograph of Eleanor laughing, sunlight in her hair, a woman captured at her most unguarded, and then hidden away for 3 decades by a man who apparently couldn't bear to look at her either. "I want to know," Maren said, "but that's not actually the thing I keep thinking about." "What are you thinking about?" "My mother." Maren folded the last letter carefully, setting it back with the others. "She grew up in a house where love got quiet and then disappeared, and she never understood why, because nobody ever told her why. She just learned that lesson without the context, that the people you love leave or get sent away, and nobody explains it, and eventually you stop asking questions because the asking itself starts to feel dangerous." She looked at Dell. "That's exactly what she taught me too." Without ever saying a word about any of this. She didn't even know she was passing it down. She just was. Dell was quiet for a long moment. The belfry hushed except for the faint creak of old timber settling somewhere below them. "What are you going to do with that?" Maren looked at the bundle of letters, the small ring, the pressed flower gone the color of old tea, the photograph of a woman who'd loved her grandfather enough to leave rather than risk hurting a child, and never got either him or the child to understand why. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I know I don't want to just fold it back up and put it away again. That's what everybody in this story keeps doing, folding things up, putting them away. I think I'm done with that particular family tradition." She thought, suddenly and with a clarity that startled her, of her mother. 6 years of silence, a wound Maren had always assumed was about her father's death and nothing more. A distance she'd let calcify because reaching across it had always felt like more risk than she could afford. Maybe her mother had learned, the same as Maren had, that love was safer kept quiet. Maybe nobody had ever told Diane that quiet wasn't actually safety. It was just a slower kind of losing. "I think I need to call my mother," Maren said, the words surprising her even as she said them out loud. Dell's expression softened into something that looked, for the first time since she'd met him, entirely unguarded. "I think your grandfather would have liked hearing you say that." Below them, through the open slats of the belfry, the afternoon light had shifted gold and long across the chapel yard, and somewhere past the tree line, that same owl she'd heard on her very first night called once into the settling quiet, as if some part of this whole tangled hidden story had just, finally, exhaled. She didn't know yet what she'd say to her mother, or whether Diane would even want to hear it. But for the first time in 6 years, she wanted to try. Not because the chapel had told her to, but because she was starting to understand, letter by letter, exactly what silence had cost 3 generations of her family, and she wasn't ready to let it cost a 4th. Maren didn't call her mother that night. She told herself it was because the light was fading and Dell still needed help securing the belfry panel, but the truth was simpler and harder to admit. She'd said the words, "I think I need to call my mother," out loud, and saying them had used up whatever courage she'd had in her that day. She called 4 days later instead, sitting on the tailgate of her car in the chapel yard, the photograph of Eleanor tucked in her jacket pocket like a kind of talisman, her thumb hovering over her mother's contact for the better part of 10 minutes before she finally pressed call. Diane picked up on the 4th ring, her voice carrying the particular wariness she always used when Maren called unexpectedly. "Maren, is everything okay? Everything's fine. Nothing's wrong." Maren closed her eyes, steadying herself. "I'm in Cedar Hollow." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Maren checked to see if the call had dropped. "Why?" Diane said finally, flat, careful. "Are you in Cedar Hollow?" "Grandpa Silas left me the chapel. In his will." Maren kept her voice even, though her heart was going hard. "I know he passed in March. I only just found out myself. Nobody told me, Mum. I didn't think you'd want to know." Diane's voice had gone tight, defensive in a way Maren recognized instantly, the same wall she'd been running into for 6 years. "You two weren't exactly close. I didn't think a phone call from me would have meant much to you either way. That's not—" Maren stopped herself, took a breath, tried again. "I found some things here, Mum, in the tower, letters, from Grandpa, and from someone named Eleanor." The silence this time was different, heavier, charged, the kind of quiet that told Maren she'd struck something real. "Where did you find those?" Diane said finally, and her voice had lost its flatness entirely, replaced by something rawer. "He built a hidden compartment in the bell tower. Del Whitfield helped me find it." "Mum, I read them. I know I probably shouldn't have, without asking you first, but I didn't know they existed until I opened it, and You had no right." The words came out sharp, sharper than Maren had heard from her mother in years, cutting clean through the phone line. "That was his private business, Maren. Whatever he did or didn't do with that woman, that was his to carry, not yours to go digging through like some kind of, 'She left because of you.'" Maren said it before she'd fully decided to, the words coming out rougher than she intended. Not because she stopped caring about him, because she was afraid of hurting you. "You were 7, Mum, and she was afraid that loving him meant taking something away from you, so she left instead. And he let her, because he didn't know how to choose both of you out loud." The line went silent again, so long this time that Maren said her mother's name twice before Diane finally spoke, her voice smaller than Maren had ever heard it. "I always thought it was my fault," Diane said. "I never knew why she left. I just knew, one day, my father stopped smiling the same way, and there'd been a woman around before that who used to braid my hair on the porch, and then she was just gone. Nobody explained anything. I was 7. I just decided, the way kids do, that I must have done something." Maren pressed a hand against her chest, against an ache that had nothing to do with anything physical. "Mum, you didn't do anything. She left to protect you. It's right there in her own handwriting." "I don't know if I can hear that right now," Diane said, and there was a wet catch in her voice that told Maren she was closer to tears than she'd allow herself to admit out loud. "I need to think. I have to go, Maren. I have to go." The call ended before Maren could say anything else. The silence afterward, somehow louder than the conversation itself had been. She sat on the tailgate for a long time, phone loose in her hand, staring at the chapel's crooked black tower against the darkening sky, wondering if she'd just torn something open that had needed to stay closed, or finally cracked something loose that had needed cracking for 30 years. Del found her there an hour later, bringing 2 mugs of coffee from his truck's thermos without being asked, settling onto the tailgate beside her, without pressing for details until she was ready to give them. "That bad?" he asked finally. She hung up on me, not angry exactly. Just overwhelmed, I think. Or maybe angry, too. Hard to tell with her. Maren wrapped both hands around the mug, letting the warmth ground her. I don't know if I did the right thing, Del. I don't know if I just handed her 30 years of grief she wasn't ready for. Maybe. Or maybe you handed her 30 years of grief she's been carrying without understanding, and now at least she's got the shape of it. Del looked out at the tower, at the chapel, at the whole quiet weight of the property settling into evening shadow. Your grandfather carried that same grief alone for 3 decades, and it hollowed him out slow, year after year. I watched it happen. I don't think silence was ever the kinder choice. I think it just felt safer. Maren thought of the letters, of Eleanor's careful, deliberate ending, of her grandfather's unsigned confession, written and rewritten 6 times before he sent it. A whole family, fluent in the language of things left unsaid. I think I broke something tonight, she said quietly. I don't know if it can be fixed. Some things that break, Del said, were already broken a long time before you touched them. You didn't break your mother's silence, Maren. You just finally stopped protecting it. Overhead, the first stars were coming out over Cedar Hollow, faint and steady, and somewhere down the road a porch light blinked on, and Maren sat with her coffee going cold in her hands, waiting to find out whether her mother would call back at all, and trying to decide whether she'd done something that would finally set this family free, or something that would cost her the one relative she had left willing to speak to her at all. 3 days passed with no word from Diane, and Maren threw herself into the chapel work with a kind of restless intensity that Del recognized without commenting on it directly. She simply worked harder, later, hauling debris until her arms shook, sanding pew wood until her hands blistered again, beneath calluses that hadn't fully hardened. The town's Sunday supper came and went without her. She told Ruth Ann she had too much work to finish, which was true, and also not the real reason, which Ruth Ann seemed to understand without being told, offering only a plate of leftovers wrapped in foil and a quiet "next time" that didn't ask for explanation. It was the storm on the 4th night that finally broke the tension building in her chest, though not in the way she expected. The forecast had promised rain. What arrived instead was something closer to violence. Wind tearing sideways across the chapel yard, lightning strobing over the black silhouette of the tower, rain coming in sheets that turned the newly cleared yard to churning mud within an hour. Maren had been sleeping in the chapel itself by then, a cot set up near the altar while she worked toward making the building livable, and she woke to a sound like the world tearing. The east wall, braced, but not yet fully rebuilt, gave way sometime after midnight. She heard it before she understood it, a groan of stressed timber, then a crack like a gunshot, then the wet crash of stone and wood collapsing inward, and she was up and moving before conscious thought caught up with instinct, grabbing her flashlight and running toward the sound instead of away from it, some reckless part of her mind screaming that the letters, the box, everything from the tower was stored in a crate near that very wall. The scaffold Del had built for the tower stairwell had partially given way too, timber groaning under wind and water, and Maren stood in the chapel's ruined heart, with rain pouring through the new gap in the wall, lightning throwing the whole scene into strobing fragments, collapsed stone, splintered wood, the crate with the letters half buried under debris, and above her, the tower itself swaying with a sound she felt in her teeth more than heard. She should have run. She knew that. Even as she was climbing over broken stone toward the crate, some rational distant part of her cataloging every reason this was exactly the kind of decision that got people killed. But the letters were in there. Eleanor's handwriting, her grandfather's confession, the one fragile thread connecting her to a truth her whole family had spent 30 years burying. And she couldn't make herself leave them to the storm. She'd gotten the crate half uncovered when the tower's damaged scaffold gave way entirely above her, a support beam crashing down not 3 feet from where she knelt, close enough that she felt the wind of it, close enough that a spray of splintered wood caught her along one forearm, hard enough to draw blood she wouldn't fully register until later. "Maren!" Dell's voice, somewhere behind her, raw with a fear she'd never heard from him. She turned in time to see him wading through debris and standing water, hauling her backward by the shoulders with a strength that surprised her, both of them stumbling clear just as another section of scaffold collapsed exactly where she'd been kneeling a moment before. They made it out through the chapel's front doors into the full fury of the storm, Dell's truck the only shelter close enough to reach, and they sat in the cab afterward, soaked through, both breathing hard, rain hammering the roof so loud they had to raise their voices to hear each other. "What were you thinking?" Dell's voice cracked with an anger that Maren understood, immediately, wasn't really anger at all. "You could have died in there. For letters, Maren. For paper. They're not just paper." Her voice shook, adrenaline and cold, and something rawer underneath both. "It's the only proof I have that any of this is real. That she loved him. That it wasn't his fault, or her fault, or my mother's fault. It's the only thing that makes any of it make sense. And if that wall had come down 2 seconds sooner, none of it would have mattered, because you'd have been under it." Dell gripped the steering wheel hard, knuckles white, staring out at the rain rather than at her. "I already lost your grandfather. I am not in any hurry to lose you too, and you've been in my life all of 11 days. The rawness of that landed somewhere Maren hadn't expected, and she sat with it in the fogged, rain-loud cab, her forearm stinging where the wood had caught her, her whole body shaking with a cold that went deeper than the storm. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I wasn't thinking. I've spent 6 years keeping myself so guarded that nothing could touch me, and the second I finally let something matter this much, I forgot how to be careful with myself too." Dell's expression softened, the anger draining into something more tired, more human. "That's the tricky part nobody warns you about. Caring about something makes you reckless in ways guardedness never did." He reached over, gently, and turned her arm to look at the cut along her forearm, wincing slightly at the sight of it. "We need to get this cleaned up, and in the morning, we're assessing that east wall and that tower before either of us goes anywhere near it again. No more solo trips into a collapsing building. You understand me? Whatever's in there, we'll keep. It's kept this long." Maren nodded, exhausted, the adrenaline finally ebbing into something closer to grief. For the wall, for the risk she'd taken without fully weighing it, for a mother who still hadn't called back, for a version of herself that had almost let a building finish what 6 years of loneliness had already started. The storm broke sometime before dawn, leaving the chapel yard drowned in mud and scattered debris. The east wall now fully collapsed, instead of merely damaged, the tower scaffold in pieces. Standing in the grey early light, surveying the wreckage, Maren felt something she hadn't expected to feel amid all the damage. Not despair, but a strange, clear-eyed resolve. The building had tested her. The building, or maybe just her own reckless grief, had very nearly cost her everything. And somehow, standing in the mud with her arm bandaged and her hands still trembling faintly from adrenaline, she understood with total clarity that she wasn't leaving. Not now, not after everything the chapel had already given her, and very nearly taken back. The call came 2 days after the storm, while Maren was standing ankle-deep in mud helping Dell sort salvageable timber from the collapsed east wall. Her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket, and when she saw her mother's name on the screen, her chest tightened so fast she had to set down the beam she was carrying before she dropped it. "Mom, I've been thinking for 2 days straight." Diane's voice was steadier than it had been on the last call, though Maren could hear the effort behind that steadiness, the careful control of someone who'd rehearsed what she wanted to say. "I found the box of things I kept from childhood. There's a photograph in it. Eleanor braiding my hair on the porch, the one I told you about. I hadn't looked at it in probably 15 years. I think some part of me needed to see her face again before I could hear anything else you had to say. Mum, I'm so sorry. I should have called you before I read any of it. I should have. Stop. Diane said it gently, not sharply. I've had 2 days to think about this, and I don't want an apology. I want to know the rest. All of it. Every letter, if you'll read them to me. A pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone rougher. I spent 30 years thinking I'd done something to make her leave. I need to actually know the truth now, even if it's hard. I'm done being afraid of it. So Maren sat on the tailgate of Dell's truck in the mud-churned yard, phone on speaker, and read every letter aloud to her mother across 400 miles of phone line. Her grandfather's careful confession, Eleanor's account of watching a 7-year-old girl's fear, the slow gentling of their correspondence toward its deliberate, honest ending. Diane cried, quietly, through most of it, and Maren cried too. And somewhere in the middle of the third letter, her mother said, in a voice thick with tears, "He never told me. 30 years, and he just let me believe I'd chased her away. Why would he do that to me?" I think he was ashamed, Maren said carefully. I think grief made him quiet instead of honest, and by the time he might have found the words, too many years had already passed for it to feel possible. I think that's the family curse, Mom. Not the chapel, not any of this. Just this specific talent we all seem to have, for loving people and going quiet, instead of saying so. The silence on the line stretched long, but it didn't feel like the old silences, the wary ones. It felt like her mother actually sitting with something, turning it over honestly. "I did that to you," Diane said finally. "Didn't I? After your father died, I went quiet instead of letting you in, and I let 6 years pass instead of fixing it, the exact same way he let 30 years pass with me." Maren's throat tightened. "Yeah, I think you did. I think I did it right back to you, too. I let the silence sit, because reaching across it felt too risky." "I don't want to keep doing that," Diane said. "I don't want to be 70 years old someday, finding some hidden box of things I should have said to you while I still had the chance." She took an audible breath. "I want to come to Cedar Hollow. I haven't been back since his funeral. I think I need to see the chapel. I think I need to see the tower and the photograph. And I think I need to finally finish something he and I left broken for 30 years." Maren looked up at the tower, still standing despite the storm, scaffold rebuilt sturdier than before over the last 2 days, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since she was 19 years old and her father had died on a wet road outside this very town. "I'd like that," Maren said. "I'd really like that, Mom." They talked another 20 minutes, tentative but real, the kind of conversation Maren hadn't had with her mother in years. Not performing closeness, not carefully avoiding anything painful, just 2 people, slowly, awkwardly, honestly finding their way back toward each other. After the call ended, Maren sat on the tailgate for a while, phone loose in her hand, watching Dell work a few yards away, sorting timber with the patient focus of a man who'd give her all the space she needed without ever fully leaving her alone in it. "She's coming," Maren said, when he finally glanced her way. Dell's whole face changed. Surprise, then something warmer. Something that looked almost like relief on someone else's behalf. "Diane's coming here. She wants to see the tower, the letters. She wants to actually finish this, instead of letting it stay buried." Maren wiped at her eyes, laughing a little, despite the tears still there. "I think that storm did something, Dell. Not just to the wall. I think it shook something loose in all of us." "Your grandfather would have been glad," Dell said quietly. "That's the whole reason he built that compartment, instead of burning what was in it. Some stubborn hope that someday, Someone would finally do something different with all that grief. Maren looked out at the chapel. Its collapsed wall now cleared, fresh timber stacked and ready for rebuilding, the tower standing steady against a sky finally clear of storm clouds, and thought about how close she'd come to losing everything in that wall's collapse, and how much closer her family had come to losing each other entirely, one careful silence at a time, across 3 full generations. Her mother was coming, not out of obligation, not for a funeral, not for anything except the deliberate choice to stop letting silence do the family's talking for it. For the first time since she'd arrived in Cedar Hollow, Maren let herself believe that whatever came next, the rebuilding, the reckoning, the slow work of finally becoming a family that said things out loud, might actually turn out okay. Diane arrived in Cedar Hollow on a clear Saturday morning 3 weeks later, pulling up to a chapel that barely resembled the wreck Maren had first pried open in the dark. The east wall stood rebuilt, new stone fitted carefully alongside the old, a deliberate choice Maren had made with the local mason, not erasing the fire damage entirely, but working with it, letting the chapel's history stay visible even as its future got sturdier around it. The roof was whole. The bell tower stood straight for the first time in decades, its scaffold finally gone, its old iron bell polished back to a dull, dignified shine. Maren watched her mother get out of the car slowly, taking in the building with an expression Maren recognized instantly, because she'd worn it herself the first night she arrived. That particular mix of grief and disbelief that comes from seeing a place that holds more of your own story than you'd been ready to admit. "It looks like it did," Diane said quietly when Maren reached her. "When I was small, before the fire, before any of it, it looks like the photograph." "That was sort of the point," Maren said. "Fixing it without pretending nothing ever happened to it." They stood together at the fence for a long moment. The same fence where Ruth Ann had once questioned Maren's intentions. The same gate Maren had hesitated at during her very first private moment of doubt. Diane's hand found Maren's, tentative, the first real physical gesture of closeness Maren could remember from her mother in years. And they walked through the gate together. Dell met them in the yard, and Maren watched something pass between him and her mother. Recognition, grief, 30 years of shared history neither of them had asked for, but both of them carried. "Diane," Dell said gently, "your father talked about you more than you probably know, even when he couldn't say much else." Diane's eyes filled, but she nodded, steadying herself, and asked to see the tower. They climbed together, slowly, Diane's hand trailing the newly reinforced rail, and in the belfry, with afternoon light slanting warm through the restored siding, Maren showed her mother the compartment, now emptied of its contents, the letters and photograph, and small wooden box, carefully preserved in an archival folder Pearl had helped her assemble. Diane held the photograph of Eleanor for a long time, tracing the edge of it with one finger, tears falling freely now, without any attempt to hide them. "She was kind to me," Diane said softly. "I remember that now, looking at this. I'd buried the memory under all that fear, but she was kind, and I was afraid of losing my father to her, and I never told anyone that fear out loud, not even him. I just let it sit in me for 30 years. You were 7, Maren said gently. None of it was your fault. Not then, and not the 30 years of silence after. That part was his, and honestly, some of it was just this family's whole particular way of loving people, badly out of fear. I don't want to keep doing it, Diane said, echoing the words from their phone call weeks before. I don't want you to inherit this the way I inherited it from him. I don't think I will, Maren said, and found she believed it. I think this chapel already broke that pattern, the day I decided to call you, instead of just folding everything back into a box and moving on. They spent that evening in the chapel's newly restored hall, Dell and Pearl and Ruth Ann, and half the town, gathered for what had turned, somewhere along the way, into an impromptu dedication. The same kind of community celebration, Pearl said, that had marked the bell tower's original rebuilding back in 1987. Someone had strung simple lights along the restored rafters. Someone else had brought enough food to feed twice the crowd that showed up. Tommy, Ruth Ann's nephew, rang the newly polished bell at dusk, and the sound rolled out over Cedar Hollow clean and whole, the way it apparently hadn't in over a decade. Maren stood in the doorway watching her mother laugh, actually laugh, at something Dell had said, watching Ruth Ann and Pearl fuss over Diane like she'd never truly left this town at all, and felt something settle in her chest that she didn't yet have a word for, except maybe home, not the chapel itself, though the chapel mattered, but this. People who'd shown up for a stranger's granddaughter and then folded that stranger's whole broken family back into the fabric of a town that had never really let go of any of them. She thought about the $340 that had started all of this. She thought about a rusted strongbox and a hidden belfry compartment and a storm that had nearly cost her everything for the sake of some old letters. She thought, most of all, about the particular lesson her grandfather had spent his whole life trying and failing and finally succeeding to teach her, that the money was never the inheritance. The chapel was never really the inheritance either. The inheritance was the choosing, the decision, made new in every generation, to either let love go quiet or say it out loud while there was still time left to say it. If there's someone in your own life you've let too much silence sit between, a parent, a sibling, anyone you've been meaning to call, maybe this is the story that finally gives you the nudge to pick up the phone. I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if this story found you at the right moment, consider subscribing. There's another story like this one waiting for you next week.